All right, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about the Indian Removal Act under Jackson. This is probably the thing that he's most famous for, you could say infamous for. Uh, the main goal of the Indian Removal Act was to move Native American tribes that were originally living in the East, mainly in the southern East. So, like, usually the tribes that we're going to be talking about today are like the Seminoles in Florida. Many tribes in Florida were actually moved out of Florida because of the Indian Removal Act. They wanted to move them west of the Mississippi. So what the Indian Removal Act did was it gave Andrew Jackson the power to negotiate and resettle Native Americans west of the Mississippi. Jackson thought that this act was an awesome idea. He believed that it would allow the Native Americans to not only keep their way of life, but it would also allow Americans to get the land that they wanted. So he kind of viewed it as a win-win, but it definitely was not a win-win. He believed that Native Americans didn't want to assimilate to American culture, and because they didn't want to assimilate, he wanted to. He and many other people during this time period wanted to move Native Americans out to west of the Mississippi River. Now, instead, this act caused death and hardship for many Native American tribes. The tribe that we're going to be talking about mainly are the Seminoles, though. So the Indian Removal Act essentially allowed Andrew Jackson to move Native Americans off of their land out west. So now many tribes went ahead and accepted the inevitable signing of this treaty and moved west. Now the Cherokee, however, filed suit against the United States and made it all the way up to the Supreme Court. Now John Marshall, who was the Supreme Court was a Supreme Court justice at the time, sided with the Cherokees. So the Cherokees won this court case. John Marshall and the rest of the Supreme Court believed that this was unconstitutional. The federal government couldn't make laws affecting Native American tribes because essentially they aren't states and they're not a part of the United States. But Andrew Jackson ignored the decision by the Supreme Court. A quote that Andrew Jackson said about this ruling made by the Supreme Court was, "Okay, well, John Marshall and the Supreme Court said that this is unconstitutional, but let's see if they can enforce it." So Jackson just went ahead and did what he wanted. He did a forced removal of the Cherokee tribe out of Georgia. Now, this forced removal, I want you to just kind of take a look at this painting that was done during this time period. I just want you to think about it. What did you see? What is this picture about? What is the feeling behind the picture? What would be a good title for this picture and why? So I just want you to pause this really quick. Just jot down a couple of answers. Just think about it. What do you see? Okay, when you're done with that, you can move on. All right, now this forced removal of the Cherokees was deemed the Trail of Tears. The Cherokee Indians had to move from their native lands in Georgia to parts of Oklahoma, Kansas, and Nebraska, these reservations out there, because the federal government wanted their land for farming, and they were looking for gold in that area as well. Now you're going to notice throughout history that Native American tribes were moved quite a bit for this reason. People were looking for land to farm, looking for gold. All right. Now this forced march was called the Trail of Tears because natives were forced by the U.S. military to walk hundreds of miles to resettle lands west of the Mississippi that they didn't have any knowledge of. Okay, that's like if we took you guys and moved you really to Nebraska, Kansas, or Oklahoma and just sat you down and said, "Okay, you need to survive now." It can be, it's stressful, it's scary. All right, now the Cherokee were forced to leave their homes with little more than just the clothes on their back and had to march for months that took place during the winter. So they weren't prepared. I mean, they're moving from Georgia to Kansas, which has a different type of climate. They weren't prepared for the type of weather that they're about to endure in this forced march by the United States military. Now, a quarter of the natives died on this trail because of starvation, the cold, and disease. Okay, a quarter. I mean, that's thousands of people that died. Now, not all tribes went out without a fight. Now, the Cherokees technically did fight, but they fought in a different way. They took their fight into the court system. Now, there were other tribes that fought this to protect their lands. They staged huge rebellions. They killed soldiers before ultimately being beaten by the government and forced to move away. Now, you'll be able to read about some of this in your books. Now, let's keep moving. So, conflict between states' rights. So, we already kind of talked about this a little bit. So we have sectionalism. So you view yourself as either a Northerner or a Southerner rather than just an American. During this time period, during Jackson's presidency, we saw a shift from the era of good feelings where people saw themselves mainly as Americans to more sectionalism. Okay, we saw people viewing themselves as either Northerners or Southerners. So in the North, Northerners wanted tariffs. We already talked about this already in class. So if you remember, Northerners wanted tariffs because they were industrialized. And by putting taxes on imported goods, it's essentially forcing the American consumer to buy American-made products. So, like I said, they're very involved in manufacturing in the North because of the War of 1812 and the embargoes that we put on Great Britain and France, kind of forcing the United States to start manufacturing. Now, the government wanted to spend money on transportation, like new roads and canals and things like that. So they believed that instead of truly taxing the American consumer, they would be able to get away with this tax by taxing these imported goods. But people don't like paying taxes. They wanted land prices in the West to stay high because low prices would attract workers away from the city and would endanger the manufacturing base in the North. They didn't want people to move away. So by putting tariffs on these goods, we see more of a Northerner feel coming out of this. All right. Remember, tariffs, creating that sectionalism. The South, on the other hand, if you remember, they're more agrarian. So they have farms. They opposed tariffs because most of their cotton was being sold to international buyers. And if the international buyers saw that taxes were going to be put on their goods coming into the United States, they're not going to buy the cotton. So therefore, the cotton is not going to be worth as much. So the Southerners didn't believe in those tariffs. They didn't want that. They also opposed federally funded improvements. They didn't want to have to pay more taxes and didn't want more tariffs. So they believed that it should be left up to the states. All right. So we see in the North, they're more federalists, and in the South, we see more states' rights. Now, people out west, they wanted the Western land to be sold cheap, so more people would move out there. They also wanted the government to spend money on transportation and goods, so it would be easier to ship goods out west to them. All right, so we're seeing sectionalism. We have people in the North, okay, manufacturing base, people in the South, your agrarian farmer base, and then the people out west. They were more of a hodgepodge. Eventually, that you're going to get more farmers out west, but people saw themselves as Westerners at this point. Now, the tariff of abominations. This is what the tariffs were called. These tariffs on imports. The tariff of abominations. Now, the tariff of abomination was a high tariff, very high tariff, to set off a huge debate in Congress. South Carolina was so upset about this tariff that they actually threatened to leave the Union. They were going to secede from the Union because they didn't want to have to pay these tariffs. Okay, now John C. Calhoun, who was a former senator of South Carolina and the vice president, declared that South Carolina was going to nullify or cancel or void the Tariff of Abominations, which is unconstitutional. A state cannot say that they don't have to follow federal government. Okay, the federal government trumps all state governments. Okay, so we're seeing sectionalism. Okay, so we have our northerners and our southerners starting to pull apart. Okay, so early problems. Now, Calhoun said that the reason why states shouldn't have to follow federal laws is if the federal law was in direct conflict with states' best interests, they shouldn't have to follow these laws. They should be able to nullify this law because it's hurting the state. Now, to further split the interests of the North and South, this further split the interests of North and South and increased sectionalism. So we're seeing that divide. All right, that's going to ultimately cause the Civil War. Now, Andrew Jackson did not agree with the idea that the law should be nullified. All right, he believed that the federal government should have the power to rule over the state governments. Even though Jackson believed in small federal government, he believed that it was still the supreme law of the land. Now, Calhoun didn't back down from his position, and he and Jackson were enemies for life from then on. All right, let's keep moving. Okay. Now, to keep South Carolina from actually seceding from the Union, the federal government backed down and actually lowered that tariff. So there was still a tariff, but it wasn't nearly as high. Now, South Carolina still believed that the tariff was too high and took it to Henry Clay, okay, the great compromiser, Henry Clay, to come up with a plan to prevent bloodshed and rebellion. Okay. In the end, the debate only further split the nation between North and South, ultimately causing the Civil War. And we don't have to do that. All right, the final last one, prosperity and panic. So the second national bank. So the first national bank was created by Alexander Hamilton, if you guys remember that. Now that bank had what was called a charter. So it was controlled by the United States, but it was only supposed to be around for X amount of years. And when that charter is up, it needed to be renewed by Congress. So we have the second national bank. All right. So under Jackson believed that the national bank was too powerful. All right. The bank's president, who was named Nicholas Biddle, controlled the money supply for the entire nation. All right. So he was able to essentially decide how much money was actually going to be out in the system. So if there was only $1 in the entire classroom, that dollar would be worth more than if everybody had $1. All right. That's basically what Nicholas Biddle was able to do. He got to decide how much money was going to be out there. Now, the bank lent money to members of Congress too, and so Biddle claimed that he would influence. So Biddle claimed he could influence congressional decisions by giving out loans to congressmen, which, in the end, I guess it could cause some problems there. And Jackson also felt the bank was partial to wealthy clients and hurt the average person. So Andrew Jackson really disliked the national bank. All right. He believed that money should be put towards the state banks. That's what Andrew Jackson believed. I want you to make sure that you remember that. He doesn't like the national bank. He wants that money in the state banks. All right. Now, when Biddle, who was in charge of the First National Bank, asked Congress to renew the bank's charter or the operating license, Congress agreed, but Jackson wound up vetoing that bill. That's very important for you to know that Jackson vetoed the bill, not Congress. Congress explained that even though the Supreme Court had upheld the constitutionality of that bank, he believed it was still unconstitutional. So if you remember what he did with the Indian Removal Act, even though the Supreme Court said something, he didn't have to follow it because technically nowhere in the Constitution is it forcing the president to do anything. That's why people viewed Andrew Jackson as somewhat of a monarch. Okay, he believed that the president should have a lot of power, and he definitely expanded that presidential power. Now, Congress passed the bill anyway with a 2/3 majority, but many people were upset because Jackson was, again, ignoring the decision of the Supreme Court. All right, he was expanding the power of the presidency when they didn't believe that he should be able to do that. All right, now, despite that, Jackson re-won election 1832, and he took that as a sign that people supported his war on the bank. Now, during his second term, Jackson began having all federal money deposited in state banks rather than the federal one. So in order to get around this law or this charter that was passed by Congress, he was just giving all the money to the states. Now, the National Bank, the founder, so Mr. Biddle, responded by making it harder for people to borrow money. But Jackson ended up putting the bank out of business by using his pet state banks to hold the nation's money. Okay, eventually this national bank would come back, but Andrew Jackson's just throwing his weight around. Now, Jackson wound up winning the war on the National Bank of the United States, but future problems did occur in the economy because of Andrew Jackson's war on the economy. Okay. Now, I want you to take a look at this description. I'm sorry, of this portrait of Andrew Jackson. So what do you see? Who's in the cartoon? What is being said about this person? Is it true or untrue? Why? When do you think this picture was created? Why? All right, so take a look at this. Make sure you're reading the stuff on the sides. What do we see down here? What is he standing on? What does he look like? Okay, take a second, write that stuff down. Okay, once you're done with that, you can move on. All right, now the Panic 1837 was caused by the National Bank being put under by Andrew Jackson. Now, Andrew Jackson was no longer president in 1837. He won in 1836. All right, but he only did 2 terms. So if you remember, 1828 and 1832, he won. His vice president ultimately became president, and during the Panic of 1837, he was basically blamed for it, even though it was Andrew Jackson's fault. His name was Van Buren. Now, banks issued too much money during this time period. So because there was too much money out there in the system, we had inflation. So money wasn't worth nearly as much as it would be. Now, back then we had this thing called a gold or silver standard. So all of your money was directly backed up by gold or silver. So what they did when inflation was happening, people panicked and wound up taking money into the banks and basically switching out their paper money for gold and silver. Ultimately, these banks ran out of gold and silver, and the paper money was deemed worthless. The country wound up going into a depression during this time period because the National Bank wasn't there to ultimately be the overseer on how much money was actually out there in the system. Now, because of this, we have the Whig Party. All right, the Whig Party was created. They opposed Jackson. All right, the nominee in 1840 was William Henry Harrison. Harrison won his election in 1840, but he died within like a month of becoming president. The reason why he died was he actually, during his inauguration, it was super cold outside, and he didn't want to wear a jacket. So he didn't wear one, and he wound up getting pneumonia and dying. So when it's cold outside, guys, wear a jacket. And that is where we'll end today. All right. So you guys have a good day. Make sure you take that Google Forms.